Russian commander shot down by his own soldiers, and this wasn't an isolated case. What happened next was even more shocking. Deep in the Ukrainian battlefields, something unthinkable is happening. Something even the most experienced military analysts couldn't predict. Russian soldiers are not just disobeying orders, they are eliminating their own commanders. Can you imagine what happens when desperate soldiers are pushed beyond the limits of human reason? Simple, the commander falls. The soldiers raise white flags and surrender to the enemy. This is not military fiction. This is happening now, and it reveals something far more terrifying than any battle. The total collapse of one of the most feared armies on the planet. You are about to discover the dark secrets behind this military implosion that no one wants you to know. A story of betrayal, despair, and the deadly price of incompetence in command. The conflict in Ukraine has reached a level that no one could imagine. And for you to understand this, we need to understand the most recent case of mutiny. In a small locality called Chazy, located near the devastated city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, something happened that should send chills down the spine of anyone who understands the dynamics of modern military conflicts. What unfolded there represents much more than a simple act of insubordination. Is a disturbing window into the internal collapse of Russian forces. Russian soldiers received a seemingly simple order: attack entrenched Ukrainian positions. But there was a fundamental problem, making this order incredibly difficult. They would have to carry out this attack completely devoid of tanks and without any artillery support. Essentially, they were ordered to run directly into enemy weapons in open field, without any protection or fire cover. The situation became even more desperate when their commander uttered a threat, revealing the brutality of the Russian military system. Anyone who did not attack would be executed immediately. The soldiers found themselves in an impossible position, facing a macabre choice between dying immediately by execution or having a minimal chance to fight and maybe survive. It was at this critical moment that something completely unthinkable happened. The soldiers, confronted with this brutal reality, made a decision that shocked even the most experienced military observers. They executed their own commander and then surrendered to Ukrainian forces. This is not an isolated case of desperate people doing extreme things in extreme situations. This specific episode represents something much deeper and systematic happening inside the current Russian military structure. It is what military experts describe using a very precise technical expression: hollow force. It is like an eggshell which on the outside looks solid and resistant, but inside is completely empty. If you apply just a little pressure, the entire structure collapses instantly. However, it is absolutely crucial to understand the informational context of this report. This news originated from Ukrainian reports and information campaigns, which means we must analyze it with appropriate scientific skepticism. Although the details are impressive and consistent with other observed patterns, there is no independent confirmation from neutral sources, which places us before a fundamental question. Is this the accurate account of a real event or a sophisticated psychological warfare operation specifically intended to undermine Russian morale? The nature of the source does not necessarily invalidate the report, but forces us to keep it in the category of unverified independent allegation, even recognizing that it fits perfectly within the broader pattern of military deterioration we are documenting through multiple independent sources, like the case we are about to know now. Even if the Chazy case remains shrouded in informational fog, similar events have been documented with surgical precision and multiple independent confirmations. On January 14, 2025, near Huliapol, in the occupied Zaporizhzhia region, Russian troops experienced an episode that not only confirmed fears about the deterioration of military discipline, but revealed the real extent of internal crisis of Russian forces. The incident involved the mechanic driver of Russian Unit 51460, who used a Kalashnikov rifle to seriously wound a sergeant and fatally execute the commander of his grenade launcher section. This was not an act of random violence or an isolated outburst of military rage. The episode occurred after systematic reports that Russian commanders were subjecting soldiers to routine torture, constant intimidation, extortion of salary cards, and service conditions that violated not only military regulations, but basic principles of human dignity. The partisan movement Atesh, which has an infiltration network inside the Russian forces themselves, meticulously documented this event. According to their reports, Russian soldiers subjected to unbearable service conditions began taking justice into their own hands against commanders in military units stationed along the Zaporizhzhia front. This pattern represents a dramatic escalation in internal violence that goes far beyond normal disciplinary conflicts. Independent confirmation of this case by multiple Western sources, including the Kiev Post and Euromaidan Press, offers a disturbing window into the internal reality of Russian forces. Partisan intelligence reveals an escalation of violence inside Russian units, where commanders allegedly torture troops and demand bribes, provoking fatal confrontations and increasing restrictions on weapons access. But the Huliapol incident was not an isolated case. Already in October 2024, agents of the Atesh partisan movement reported that Russian soldiers from the Zaporizhia region were refusing to advance, with agents from the 1,440th Motorized Rifle Regiment stating that certain squads were completely refusing to participate in offensive operations. The soldiers began describing advance orders as suicide, a perception that spread rapidly through the ranks. What makes this case particularly significant is the response of the Russian command. After the commander was shot down, severe restrictions on access to personal weapons were implemented as a direct response to these events. This measure reveals not only institutional fear of new incidents, but also an admission that internal violence was becoming a systemic problem, not an isolated event. The Atesh intelligence network, which claims to have 2,000 people infiltrated in the Russian Army and National Guard, performing daily various types of operations, sabotaging orders, leaking information, disabling military equipment, and neutralizations, has been fundamental to exposing these events. Their agents are literally embedded inside the Russian forces themselves, providing an unprecedented insider perspective on the collapse of military cohesion. This specific episode in Zaporizhia represents more than a breakdown of military discipline. It symbolizes the breaking point where Russian soldiers, facing threats both from abusive commanders and impossible military operations, choose violence against their own superiors as the only viable alternative. It is a dramatic indicator that the Russian command structure is not only tactically failing, but is literally self-destructing from the inside out. To understand how we reach this critical point, we need to go back to the beginning of the conflict. When the military operation started in February 2022, the Russian army had a solid core of highly trained professional soldiers. These troops represented the Russian military elite with years of experience and specialized training. However, in the devastating first months, these units suffered catastrophic losses in intense fighting around Kherson, Donetsk, and Mariupol. The speed and intensity of casualties exceeded any replenishment plan, forcing Moscow into a desperate decision to send civilian recruits with minimal preparation. Peasants, factory workers, students, and public employees were drafted and sent to the front after training that often lasted only 2 weeks. The result was a fundamental transformation in the nature of the Russian army. Externally, it maintained the appearance of a formidable force, with modern tanks and sophisticated artillery systems. Internally, however, there was a devastating void of experience, discipline, and military cohesion. Military analysts began using the term hollow force to describe this situation. An army that seemed powerful on the surface, but lacked the fundamental human elements that make a military force effective. The difference between appearance and reality became an abyss that no amount of equipment could fill. The pressure to replace casualties transformed the Russian military system into an improvised and dysfunctional recruitment machine. Thousands of civilians, with no familiarity with military tactics or handling heavy weapons, were thrown to the front as numbers in a grim attrition statistic. These inexperienced troops saw poorly planned missions collapse within minutes. Operations that should have been coordinated became one-sided massacres, costing dozens of lives for every meter gained. Each operational failure created not only physical casualties, but a growing sense of futility and despair among survivors. The Russian government responded to every wave of losses with a new call for civilians who had never held a weapon. The pattern repeated relentlessly. Almost no preparation, failed operation, high casualties, new recruitment. This human attrition spiral not only depleted Russian manpower, but fundamentally eroded trust between soldiers and commanders. The growing ineffectiveness of Russian troops directly impacted progress on the front lines, turning every territorial gain into a victory too costly to sustain. In multiple sectors, armored and infantry units managed to advance only a few meters per day, a pace that would turn any significant strategic goal into a decades-long effort, not months. This absolute slowness completely undermined unit morale, making it clear that numerical superiority and modern equipment are useless without properly trained and motivated soldiers. The tactical reality on the ground became a brutal lesson on the importance of the human factor in modern military doctrine. At the same time, the loss of more than 5,000 officers, including generals and mid-level commanders, paralyzed operational coordination at all levels. Western intelligence reports document troops operating without clear orders, units acting completely independently, and in extreme cases, firing on comrades by mistake. Ukraine, recognizing this structural weakness, directed surgical attacks against Russian leaders using precision drones and special operations teams. This decapitation strategy of military leadership deepened the command vacuum, creating a vicious cycle of operational disorganization. On the psychological front, reports of mutinies and internal executions functioned as devastating propaganda weapons. For Moscow, they represented a direct blow to the military invincibility reputation built over decades. For Kiev and its Western allies, they offered opportunities to amplify the Russian trust crisis through strategic disinformation campaigns. Internationally, the image of a demoralized and fragmented army encouraged new economic sanction packages and accelerated Western military aid to Ukraine, dramatically reversing the battlefield balance. The Russian command structure, still firmly rooted in rigid Soviet hierarchies, proved completely incapable of adapting to the fluidity and complexity of modern conflict. With the systematic killing of thousands of experienced officers, institutional tactical knowledge simply evaporated, leaving critical field decisions in the hands of sergeants and young recruits with no operational experience. A particularly revealing testimony comes from Mikhail Simdyankin, a former soldier who served in a frontline unit. His account, published by the Wall Street Journal, offers an intimate perspective of the reality lived by Russian soldiers. "I had only 2 weeks of training before being sent to the front line," he described with brutal honesty. "There was no time to learn anything beyond the absolute basics about how to hold a weapon and follow simple orders." Simdyankin continued, "When we got to the front, we found many of our supposed comrades were already seriously wounded. Nobody really knew who was actually in command of the situation. Orders changed constantly, sometimes hour by hour. It was then I realized we were completely disposable, just pieces in a military game none of us really understood." In desperate response to any sign of hesitation or questioning, Russian commanders resorted to internal terror tactics that violated not only basic military norms, but fundamental human rights. Soldiers routinely report that when questioning clearly impossible orders, they were confronted with direct execution threats. "If you don't advance immediately, I will put a bullet in you right here and now," became a common phrase heard by soldiers showing any reluctance to obey impossible orders. Formal complaints to the Russian Military Prosecutor's Office, filed in May 2025, described systematic episodes of physical and psychological torture. Soldiers were routinely handcuffed in improvised containers and subjected to brutal interrogations designed specifically to break their will to resist. These methods included sleep deprivation, beatings, and threats against family members at home. To reinforce the climate of absolute terror, special detachments carried out public shootings of alleged deserters, theatrical displays meant to deter any thoughts of disobedience among the remaining troops. These executions, besides blatantly violating the Geneva Conventions and international norms of conduct in conflicts, dramatically deepened hatred and despair in military ranks. The result was turning every patrol into a test not only of courage against the Ukrainian enemy, but of psychological resistance to the Russian command itself. Soldiers began to fear their superiors as much as they feared combat, creating a completely dysfunctional military dynamic that made any coordinated operation practically impossible. Noticing this internal fragmentation, Ukraine developed a brilliant psychological strategy that directly capitalizes on the growing despair of Russian soldiers. The Ukrainian government created the project I Want to Live, a government initiative offering Russian soldiers a concrete alternative to death on the battlefield or execution by their own commanders. The program had received over 35,000 requests by May 2024, mostly from active Russian military personnel, with over 300 soldiers already surrendering through this initiative. The official website was accessed more than 36 million times, with 32 million of those visits coming directly from Russian territory, a statistic revealing massive despair inside Russian forces themselves. The genius of the program lies in its humanized approach. Instead of simply encouraging desertion, Ukraine promised humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, protection against violence and intimidation, and even the possibility of remaining in Ukraine after the conflict. This is not a program trying to convince happy, motivated soldiers to switch sides. It offers a dignified way out for soldiers who are already at their psychological and physical limit. More than 1 million Russians have already called, messaged, or visited the Ukrainian hotline website, demonstrating that the moral crisis inside Russian forces is much broader than the individual documented cases suggest. The mutinies in Zaporizhia and the controversial reports from Chesy, whether fully verified or partly propagandistic, reveal a consistent and deeply disturbing picture. An army undermined by internal structural failures, total lack of cohesion, and a leadership crisis far beyond superficial tactical problems. When soldiers are routinely forced to face missions without minimum survival conditions, deprived of proper armor, without basic supplies, and under constant threat of execution by their own commanders, the inevitable result is a moral and operational collapse no amount of tanks or artillery can fix. These episodes expose a fundamental truth about modern military doctrine. Any armed force relying exclusively on brute firepower, but completely neglecting the human factor, is doomed to operational failure. The war in Ukraine has become a tragic laboratory of this lesson, showing that dehumanized soldiers terrified by their own commanders cannot form an effective military force, no matter how sophisticated their equipment. The internal fragmentation of Russian forces represents not only a tactical military failure, but a broader collapse of command systems that prioritize control through fear over leadership through competence and mutual respect. If you found this video impactful and want to continue understanding the complex backstage of this conflict, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos. Comment below, in your opinion, what fundamental changes would be necessary to avoid these discipline collapses and preserve human lives in conflict situations. Your participation helps us keep bringing verified information and deep analysis about these events shaping contemporary history.